Good evening and welcome to Law Line. Law Line is a live call-in talk show hosted by the attorneys of Levin, Papantonio. My name is Ben Gordon. I'm here with my colleague Daniel Nye. Daniel and I are going to talk to you tonight a little about hip implants and hip implant litigation. People don't realize this, but hip implants have been around for 60 or 70 years in one form or fashion, but they have escalated in their use tremendously really in the last decade or so, and that's led to problems, as you might imagine, particularly with some of the modern metal-on-metal hip implants you've heard a lot about. Daniel, why don't you tell some of our viewers, until we get some callers, a little about the history and the evolution of how hip implants have come to be so popular?
Sure, thanks, Ben. Well, essentially there's really three different types of hip implants that we have out on the market, three major types. First off, we have this. This is the most popular model type of a hip implant, so most of you who have a hip implant probably have this model. Essentially, it's called a metal on polyethylene, and the polyethylene stands for the polyethylene liner. This is the acetabular cup that goes into your acetabulum. Polyethylene liner fits in there. We have the metal ball, and then you've got the femoral stem that hooks there and goes into your femoral bone. So essentially, this is now known as the gold standard after we've had some problems with the metal on metal hips, and we'll talk about that a little more later on. There's also a ceramic, all different types of ceramic hip implants that are becoming more popular now. Specifically, the Stryker Rejuvenate's one that we're going to be talking about. And then finally, the metal on metal. Essentially, what happened with metal on metal, we had metal on metal back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it was popular back then until they found out about one big problem, and that's metal ions were being shaved going out into the body because they didn't have the polyethylene liner in between the metal and the metal. So metal on metal, you would see this edge loading on the ball, and you have metal ions going out to the body. Particularly the McKee-Ferrar prosthesis was the one in the 1980s where they ultimately did away with metal on metal. And then all of a sudden, around the turn of the century, one journal article came out that all these orthopedic scientists and manufacturers jumped onto the bandwagon and started to promote metal on metal. You know, and essentially I'm going to leave there and take it over to Ben to discuss really why the marketing had played such a role and trumped science. And
let me ask you, as I do this so the listeners understand, we've got a couple of callers, we'll get to that in a minute. Now, is this what you call a modular hip implant, Daniel?
Yes, it is.
So tell the viewers, if you will, the difference between this modular device with multiple pieces and a device that doesn't have so many parts.
Okay. Essentially, modular, there's two different types, modular and monoblock. Essentially, modular means, for the most part, there's a liner. So if it's got a liner, we generally know that it's modular, and by that, what modular essentially means you can change it to all different types. You can have a polyethylene liner, you can have a metal liner, I don't have that to show you, but you can have a metal liner. You can also have a ceramic ball, and then some of the other modularity components will be tapers and things of that nature that allow you to adjust the hip implant as the surgeon's putting it inside of your body.
That's great. Very good explanation, Daniel. Before we go to the callers and talk about injuries and damages and some of the problems that we see with some of these implants, I want to talk a little about how they were marketed. Now, obviously, different companies market implants and medical devices in different ways, and there are a number of different hip implant manufacturers, as you know. One of the ones that I work closely on with Daniel is the DePuy hip implant litigation. DePuy is a company, DePuy Orthopedics, that had a recall back in late 2010, August of 2010, of what's called an ASR implant, an articular surface replacement implant, which is, it has two types of devices, Daniel mentioned, both a monoblock type of device for resurfacing, which we'll talk about in a minute. Resurfacing is a little bit of a different process, and we'll show you some photos of that, as well as the modular implants that result in a total hip arthroplasty, as Daniel described, with a full femoral stem, as well as the acetabular cup and the intervening components. But the companies like DePuy, like Smith & Nephew, that has another product, like Wright Medical and Biomet and some of these others that we'll talk to you about in a few minutes, market in very different ways. And in particular, companies like DePuy, unfortunately, got the money ahead of the safety. Instead of focusing on patient safety and clinical outcomes and how patients would do with a given product, they got onto a bandwagon, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, with this notion that this is such a huge marketing opportunity. There are so many people out there who can benefit from orthopedic implants, and particularly hip implants, that they took it from a market of about 100,000 people a year in the United States throughout the 90s, plus or minus, to close to 500,000 people a year by 2010. So in a scant 10 to 15 years, we saw a quintupling, a multiple of 5 times as many people getting hip implants from the late 90s until 2010. Is that because the population has become that much more aged in those 10 or 15 years, and 70 and 80-year-olds are that much more prevalent and need hip implants 5 times as much? It's not. What it is the companies decided we can move the technology in a direction that will allow younger and younger people to benefit from hip implants. Problem is, they didn't base it on studies. They didn't do any clinical testing. As Daniel mentioned, there were metal-on-metal hip implants around decades ago. Why didn't they take off? Why didn't they become popular? Why did they go to one with a polyethylene sleeve in the middle? Because they didn't work, because they were failing. Now, they weren't put on the market in a big way, so no one really got a big awareness of the numbers. So the company said, this is an opportunity where we can put a hard shell with a hard ball and sometimes into a sleeve, where hard on hard is better. These large balls will give a greater range of motion and cause less dislocation, so the story went, and we will market them to 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds instead of just 70 and 80-year-olds. We have one client, I think Daniel, was 29, I believe.
That's right.
So these things were, put out to a market that would broaden their ability to sell billions and billions of dollars worth of these devices without any clinical safety testing. Now, we'll talk in a minute about the regulatory pathway, because everyone knows about the FDA and everyone thinks, well, the FDA is going to screen these devices, right? These are Class 3 medical devices. The FDA ranks them in 4 classes. Class 3 is something that can pose a substantial risk of harm or safety issues in human beings. It's an implantable medical device, after all. So the companies have 2 different routes to approval. They have either the pre-market approval application, which requires onerous testing and clinical safety data to be established, or they can go a much simpler route called the PMA, called the 510K, which is a section of the Code of Federal Regulations, in which companies can say, look, this device is substantially similar to a device that was on the market previously. They can say that. Don't have to prove it. They can say it. If the FDA accepts it, all they have to get is a pre-market notification, which takes 90 days. Meaning in 90 days, they can have a new one of these designed in a very different way without any testing or safety, clinical efficacy, and they can put that on the market, which is what happened with ASR. Guess what? It turned out it was different. Didn't have these holes for screw fixation. Had a much more flat, sub-hemispherical design, which caused multiple problems with edge loading, as Daniel mentioned, a number of different design issues that, because it didn't have to go through the pre-market approval application of the FDA and get that kind of scrutiny, it got on the market very quickly in a big way. 93,000 people in the world, 36,000 or so in the United States. Thousands of them have already filed lawsuits. We represent a number of them. Without further ado, before we go back into some of the other manufacturers, let's take one of our callers. We have 3 lines holding. I'm going to go to the top line. Hello, you're on Law Line. Can we take your question, please?
Yes, I was wondering if you could tell me, how do I know which hip implant model I have, and also whether it's a case that you all are pursuing?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I'm going to take your question off the air. Let me let you go, and I'll get to that. The question by the caller is, how can he tell what kind of hip implant is in his body, and how can he tell if it's a product that we're handling? Daniel, you want to take that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate that. Essentially, there's a couple ways you can go, but really the important thing is when the surgeon does your surgery, he's going to take these come in a box, and there's going to be stickers on the outside. He's going to take the stickers that show what the product is, and he's going to put it on the, sometimes they'll put it on the operative report, they'll stick it to the back, but essentially you need to see those implant stickers. That's going to tell you precisely what model that you have. Another way you can go about it, so we can get those records particularly, sometimes you can call up your surgeon's office and ask the front desk. The important thing is, though, it's not enough to just know who the manufacturer is. You need to know the specific model. And the reason for that is every manufacturer has 50, 100 different types of hip implants and knee implants, so it's important to know specifically which one. And by that, for example, if you know that you call into your surgeon's office and they tell you you had a DePuy hip, Well, that doesn't tell us enough, because specifically we handle DePuy ASR hips, we handle DePuy Pinnacle hips, and essentially what you need to know then is you need to know not only that it's a DePuy, but it's a DePuy Pinnacle or that it's a DePuy ASR. So those are essentially the ways that you can find out which hip implant you have. And then finally, you can always check our website, which is www.levinlaw.com, and you can go to the hip replacement website and you can see the list of all the different manufacturers that we handle.
Very good job, Daniel. Thank you. That's a good answer. I will say there are a number of cases we're looking at now, some newer ones. The screen has mentioned Stryker, for example. We'll talk a minute about Stryker. We'll talk about Smith & Nephew and the R3 recall that they had, as well as the Birmingham hip resurfacing device. But we have 3 callers holding, so let's go back to the phones and take the next caller, and then we'll come back to some of those topics. Hello, thank you for holding. You're on Law Line. Can we take your question, please?
Yes. Can you tell me how much these cases are worth and how long do they usually take to settle?
Good question. We're going to take that off the air. Thank you for your call. So the caller wants to know how much these cases are worth and how long they take to settle. I'll take that one and let Daniel follow up. You know, these cases are mass torts. Anytime there's a mass tort with thousands of people injured and numerous products and multiple manufacturers, they often lead to what's called an MDL, multi-district litigation. We are on multiple MDL steering committees. Right now I'm on the executive committee for the DePuy ASR litigation. That litigation has already been going on for 2 years. So to answer the second question first, it generally, as an average ballpark, takes 2 to 4 years as a minimum to resolve mass tort litigation. And it's because there are so many people involved, so many injured plaintiffs and so many defendants that it takes time to assimilate all the data, to handle all the pre-trial discovery and coordinated proceedings, and then possibly to try what we call a bellwether case or 2 or more to establish a value for the cases. That gets us to the caller's first question, which was, what's the value for these cases? Of course, that's very variable, very dependent on a lot of factors. We're going to talk about injuries. Daniel's going to handle some of that and give you better insight into it. But I'll give you a ballpark, generally speaking, for hip implant revision cases. If you have a hip implant that fails and needs to be replaced, your case, generally speaking, is going to be worth 6 figures. That means because of the medical losses, because of the pecuniary losses, lost earnings and out-of-pocket expenses, as well as the pain and suffering, your case is going to be worth over $100,000. Now, that's very general. Obviously, 6 figures could be anything from $100,000 to $999,000, $1 million, so that's a big range. And it's not to say that there wouldn't be cases that might be worth over $1 million. We have clients who've had, because of the failure of their initial acetabular shell, they've gotten infections later, they've gotten multiple revisional surgeries, sometimes 4 and 5 surgeries. Those people have $1 million cases. But that's the exception and not the rule. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I handled what was known as some Sulzer hip implant cases. Sulzer required a product, recalled a product very much like this, an acetabular shell. Didn't cause a degree of injuries that some of our current clients are suffering from, and Daniel's going to talk about these metal injuries, metallosis caused by metal debris, but the shell itself failed to osseointegrate, failed to grow into the acetabulum, to the hip socket of these patients, and as a result, they developed a loosening of the implant and pain and suffering until they could get it replaced. Once it was replaced, most of those people did very well. We settled those cases on average for about $200,000. So it gives you a good kind of ballpark for an uncomplicated case of a hip implant that requires revision. Probably you're looking at plus or minus $200,000. If there are complications, it could be much more than that. Anything else, Daniel?
Oh, that's good. A couple things I will add to that is essentially the modular cases where we are taking some of those where there's a modular metal liner. Those are going to be an uphill battle to be able to prove the liability on the part of the manufacturer on the modular metal-on-metal liners. Essentially, the monoblock it would be your DePuy ASR recalled product, your recalled Zimmer Duron product, Wright Medical Conserve Plus, and the Biomet Magnum M2A. Those are probably cases that certainly will probably have more of a value than those that have the modular liner. But essentially, I would add that as of right now, we've got an uphill battle. It could take 3 to 5 years for those modular liner cases to come into fruition and see a settlement on those cases.
Good points. Thank you for the call, caller. All right, we've got 2 more lines holding. Let's go to the next line. Good evening. You're on Law Line. Welcome to the show, and thank you for calling. Can we take your question, please?
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I was wondering, what are the signs that a hip implant has failed and needs to be replaced?
Okay, the caller's question is, what are the signs, and stay on the line, you might have a follow-up to this, the signs that a hip implant has failed and needs to be replaced. Daniel was about to talk about some of the injuries that people are suffering and how they know they've been harmed by a failed prosthesis. So Daniel, you want to go ahead and tackle that one?
Sure. First off, the key is when you're starting to feel pain or any symptoms, make sure you go to your orthopedic surgeon. That's the first thing. I can't tell you how many patients and clients that I've spoken with that haven't gone to their orthopedic surgeon over a year and they're having pain and things of that nature. So first thing, go to your orthopedic surgeon. Let them know specifically about the symptoms you're having. Don't downgrade those. Tell them everything that relates to the hip pain that you're having. He's then going to do a series of orthopedic exams, and he's going to be able to figure out, localize where the localized pain is, or if it's just a generalized pain, things of that nature. But on top of that, for the metal on metal, I want to talk about those specifically. Really what we're seeing is you're seeing those metal ions going out into the body and it's causing shavings to get into the tissue, the synovial fluid, to get into your bone, and also into the bloodstream. Now essentially, the first time that you go to your doctor, they may have only been taking an x-ray when they realized it was a metal on metal hip implant. Now the FDA has come up with new recommendations as to cobalt chromium blood test, taking a Mars MRI, CT scan, or ultrasound. The cobalt chromium blood test is going to detect, those are the metal ions coming off the cup or from the stem, and it's going to be able to detect just how much cobalt and chromium you have in the blood. And at some point, depending on the hip prosthesis, things of that nature, generally, if you've got over a 1 parts per billion for cobalt and chromium, there's an indication there may be something there, especially if you combine that with the symptoms that you're having. But in addition, if you may also not have any pain at all with a metal on metal hip, and you may have problems with that hip. So it's important to make sure you get the cobalt chromium blood test and follow up with your orthopedic surgeon, especially if you've got a metal on metal hip implant.
So Daniel, what if, like our caller here, for example, goes back to see their orthopedic surgeon and has some of these kinds of symptoms like pain and gets the blood test, and the blood test says they have 10 parts per billion of chromium or cobalt, and the doctor says, well, let's just take a wait and see approach. What would you tell this patient?
Okay. I'd have a little bit of a concern if the doctor hasn't done anything else. Oftentimes, it may be wise for the doctor to do an ultrasound or do a Mars MRI, not necessarily recommend that you revise the product right at that time. The doctor also has to take several factors into account, your age, activity, things of that nature, and determine whether or not you should have a revision. But ultimately, if you have a cobalt chromium blood test that's 10 parts per billion, I would recommend calling us and having a discussion with us. There may be the possibility that you need to go seek a second opinion as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would tell you also, caller, definitely if you're having these symptoms like pain, popping or clicking, audible noises with the prosthesis, these are signs that there is some loosening or some kind of failure of the device. And if you have a surgeon, and we've had this happen, who simply does not think anything needs to be done clinically, surgeons over the last 2 years have come a long way. A lot of them have done a 180-degree turnabout, particularly on the metal on metal implants, as Daniel says, with people having these kinds of symptoms. Generally speaking, if there's severe pain, even if it's just subjective complaints of pain, but by itself, that may be enough to require revision of the prosthesis. Obviously, we're not doctors, but it may, as Daniel said, lead you to need a second opinion. Certainly, if you've got any kind of radiographic evidence of loosening of the prosthesis together with pain or these elevated ion numbers, most surgeons these days are going to say it's better safe than sorry. Early removal leads to less tissue damage, less abductor muscle damage, less bone loss, and therefore a better, less complicated revision and hopefully a better long-term result. So, did we answer your question, caller?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for the call.
One other thing I'd like to add to that as well, it's very important that as soon as you're having those symptoms that you go to the orthopedic surgeon. The other thing is, when the orthopedic surgeon recommends that you have a diagnostic test, make sure you do it. If you end up neglecting your symptoms or don't do the appropriate diagnostic test, you may run into several significant complications as a result of these metal on metal hip implants. First one I'd talk about is a pseudotumor. You can have a pseudotumor that forms inside of your body. You can also get a crack in the acetabulum. You can get a joint fluid washout where you have a total dislocation. And finally, you can also have eating away of your adductor muscles. All of those can be very significant. And in fact, I've got patients and clients who have had each of those problems as well. So You need to get those diagnostic tests as soon as the doctor tells you, and make sure if you're having symptoms to go into your doctor. Don't ignore them.
Now, thank you, Daniel. We've got one more caller holding, but before we go to that call, let's talk a little about some of the other products that are out there. Now, we've talked in the past about Sulzer implant that was recalled because of a manufacturing problem they had. We've talked about the design issues with the ASR, some of those design issues and why it was recalled. I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk a little about it now, that Smith & Nephew created a product called the R3. The R is an initial for their reflection series of implants, and the R3 refers to the fact that they have this new, as of a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago, group of modular components for their hip implants, for total hip arthroplasties. And the 3 is, there's a metal liner, there's a poly liner, and there's a ceramic liner. That's the R3. Well, they recalled the R3 metal liner. They said because the clinical data weren't as robust, weren't as strong as they wanted them to be. What they actually called it was a market withdrawal, a voluntary market withdrawal, as opposed to a recall. 6 one, half dozen the other. It's the same thing. They recalled this R3 metal liner because, and we're talking to many of these patients now, because lots of these patients are suffering failures of their implant that leads to metallosis and high cobalt levels and all the things that we're talking about. But one of the concepts that's interesting about the R3, and we talked a little about the FDA earlier, is that they had that device approved under a pre-market approval application that was part of the BHR, the Birmingham Hip Resurfacing Device, that was approved in 2006 by the FDA as the first major resurfacing device. There are 3 companies that have these resurfacing devices, and I'm going to show you a picture, see if you can see this, to kind of explain a little about what resurfacing is. This is a picture produced by Smith & Nephew. I don't know if we can zoom in on this, that shows you over on this side the actual femoral bone where the cap is implanted with a pin straight down into the person's femur instead of a long, show them that femoral stem. So instead of a 7-inch long femoral stem, you have about 1.5 inches, 2-inch long stem that sticks into this cap that goes onto the femur. The idea is that there's more bone preservation, less bone loss, because typically when you do this type of implant, Daniel showed earlier, this is your new femur. This goes into your femur, and they cut off the head of your femur. So the femoral ball is actually cut off and replaced with a large metal head. Well, the thinking was that they could create with this device a less drastic procedure, and a procedure in which the cap is simply put onto the existing femoral head if the bone is good enough, and then this cap right here is actually glue. You see him putting, it looks like Elmer's glue, putting glue down into the cap, and then that cap actually implanted on top of the head, and then this entire head, or the femoral head, and this head then stuck into the acetabulum. So the idea was that this resurfacing device would be less cumbersome, less expensive, less invasive, and that it would be a better procedure for the patients. As it turns out, that was not the case, but because Smith & Nephew got this device approved through the FDA on this PMA device, arguably these cases can't be brought because of a doctrine under federal law called preemption. So they got the R3 liner approved under a supplement to that device, but we're fighting that. We don't think it's right. This is kind of a long story, so I won't bore you with too many more details because we have a caller holding. But the long story short is, if you have a Smith & Nephew product, we'll be happy to look at that case too and see if we can help you. So we have one more caller, just a couple of minutes left. Let's take this final call. Caller, thank you for calling Law Line. We're sorry to keep you on hold so long. What's your question, please?
Yes, this is the metal on metal. I have a parent, my father's actually has tooth and a replacement. And my question is, are there other options better than the current metal on metal? And the reason he's having his removed is because of pain and high metal levels.
That's great. Thank you, caller. I'm sorry, it's not great, but it's a good question. And we've talked a lot about metal on metal. We're down to about 3 minutes on the show now, so I'll go ahead and answer that and let Daniel follow up. But the question from the caller is, father has a metal on metal hip implant, has to get it removed. Is there something better on the market? We talked a little about the outset. You may not have seen that part of the program, caller, but again, it obviously requires medical judgment. But I will say this: the FDA, as of 2 months ago, is giving increased, heightened scrutiny to all metal on metal products. There are a lot of other options. There's ceramic on ceramic. There's metal on polyethylene, which is like the model that we have here that Daniel showed earlier. So what your dad needs to ask the surgeon is there a product like this that has an interface of polyethylene or ceramic components that would avoid the specter of the metal-on-metal problem that we've seen in so many of these patients. Anything, Daniel, to add to that?
The only thing I would add is I've spoken with many clients who have had these revisions where they've had the metal-on-metal hip implant taken out and they've had a successful recovery. So generally they'll replace it with the metal-on polyethylene or one of the ceramic components. And what I would say is, you know, generally after a couple of months, they can oftentimes have a good recovery.
And you know, there are a lot of good surgeons out there, a lot of good doctors, obviously, who know all these different products. So just make sure your father's well informed and ask the right questions. And hopefully, most doctors these days are pretty much shying away from the metal-on-metal. So did we cover your question, caller? Did we lose the caller? Okay, I think we'll thank you for the call. All right, so I think that was our last caller. I think we need to wrap things up. Let me close by saying that you know, we're looking at all hip implant cases, but particularly the Stryker Rejuvenate cases. If you know you had a Stryker, some of the doctors are sending out letters. If you know you had a Stryker case, this was a recent recall. It was just recalled in July. If you know you had a Smith & Nephew, it was just recalled in June. Obviously, if you know you had a DePuy, ASR metal-on-metal, or Pinnacle metal-on-metal, we're very interested in those cases. If you had a Wright or a Biomet, we're looking at those too. Any that I missed, Daniel?
I think you've got them all. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that pretty much covers all of the different types of implants we're looking at. We're looking at knee implant cases as well. So if you have any knee implant issues or you know, friends who've had knee implants with problems, we're happy to talk to them. Certainly any hip implants, particularly metal-on-metal, and if you've had a recall of your product, then very much interested in seeing if we can advise you of your legal rights. I think that wraps up another edition of Law Line.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.